The thunder of a runaway stagecoach echoed through the dusty streets of Hillsboro, New Mexico Territory, 1884, as Nora Sullivan leaped from her porch and into its path. 6 feet tall in her stockings with shoulders broader than most men's, she braced herself against the oncoming disaster while townsfolk scattered in panic. The lead horses reared at the sight of her, but Nora didn't flinch. With a strength that had been whispered about from saloon to church pew, she grabbed the bridle of the nearest horse and pulled with everything she had. "Whoa there!" she shouted, her voice deep and commanding. The horses slowed, their momentum dragging her boots through the dirt for several yards before finally coming to a halt. The stagecoach rocked precariously, then settled as its passengers cried out in relief. Nora's breath came hard and fast as she steadied the trembling horses. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and she wiped it away with a forearm that bore the muscle of years working her father's smithy. Her calloused hands were still firm on the bridle when she heard the first whispers, just like a man, that one. "Unnatural, I tell you. Poor Sullivan girl. No wonder she can't find herself a husband." Nora's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes on the horses. 25 years of such comments had taught her to pretend deafness. She checked the horses for injury, her practiced hands moving efficiently over their heaving flanks. "You all right up there?" She called to the driver, a thin man named Jenkins who was clutching the reins in white-knuckled hands. "Yes, Miss Sullivan," he stammered. "Don't know what got into them." 1 minute calm as can be, next minute, "Rattlesnake," Nora interrupted, pointing to the edge of town where a diamond-patterned serpent was slithering away. They smelled it before they saw it. She stepped back from the coach, suddenly aware of the crowd gathering around her. Women drew their children close as if her difference might be contagious. Men shuffled uncomfortably, some averting their eyes from her tall frame, others staring with open curiosity. Sheriff Wells pushed through the crowd. "Another rescue, Miss Sullivan. Town's getting to owe you a fair bit." Nora dusted off her simple cotton dress, now streaked with dirt and horse sweat. "Just did what anyone would do, Sheriff." "Not anyone could stop 6 runaway horses, madam." The voice came from behind her, deep and warm like honey over gravel. Nora turned to face a stranger. He stood leaning against the post office wall, a tall man himself, though still 3 inches shy of her height. His sun-bronzed face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see his eyes green as the pines that dotted the distant mountains. A smile played at the corners of his mouth, not mocking but genuinely impressed. "Name's Grant Lawson, madam," he said, pushing off from the wall and approaching with the easy gait of a man comfortable in his own skin. "Just rode into town and nearly got run over by that coach. Fine display of strength I just witnessed." Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the New Mexico sun. Most men didn't look her in the eye, much less compliment her strength. "Nora Sullivan," she replied, extending a hand before remembering that ladies were supposed to offer a delicate wrist, not a firm handshake. She hesitated, then committed to the gesture. Grant took her hand without hesitation, his grip matching hers. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Sullivan." Sheriff Wells cleared his throat. "Lawson here is our new blacksmith, taking over Old Man Peterson's forge." He looked between them with undisguised curiosity. "Guess you two will be neighbors of sorts, what with your father's smithy just down the road." Nora withdrew her hand, suddenly conscious of the coal dust permanently embedded in her fingernails. "My father's retired now. I run the smithy." Grant's eyebrows rose slightly, but the impressed smile never left his face. "Is that so? I'd be interested to see your work." Before Nora could respond, Mrs. Pemberton, the mayor's wife and self-appointed guardian of Hillsboro's social graces, stepped forward with a painted smile. "Mr. Lawson, we're so pleased to welcome you to our little community. We must have you for dinner soon." She cast a disparaging glance at Nora's dirt-streaked dress and wild auburn hair that had mostly escaped its bun. "You must be tired after your journey. Allow me to show you to your accommodations." Nora stepped back, knowing her cue to disappear. She'd learned long ago that her presence made the proper ladies of Hillsboro uncomfortable. Too tall, too strong, too outspoken, she was a constant reminder of what a woman shouldn't be. "Actually, madam," Grant said, his eyes still on Nora, "I was hoping Miss Sullivan might point me toward the blacksmith shop. Seems to me she'd know better than anyone what supplies I might need to get started." Mrs. Pemberton's smile froze, her eyes widening at this social misstep. "I'm sure Miss Sullivan is very busy. Perhaps Mr. Sullivan, my father's arthritis keeps him homebound these days," Nora interjected. "But Mrs. Pemberton is right. You must be tired from your journey. Perhaps tomorrow would be better." Grant studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Tomorrow, then. First thing, I light the forge at dawn," Nora warned him, expecting this to deter the man. His smile widened. "Perfect. I'll bring coffee." As Grant walked away with the flustered Mrs. Pemberton, Nora became aware of the stares and whispers around her. She straightened her spine, reaching her full height, something her mother had always scolded her for, and walked purposefully back toward her smithy. The familiar smell of coal and iron embraced her as she entered the workshop her father had built 30 years ago. The forge was cold now, the day's work finished, but tools hung in perfect order on the walls, and finished pieces, horseshoes, hinges, and more elaborate items sat ready for collection. This place, with its sooty walls and glowing heart, was the only spot in Hillsboro where Nora felt completely herself. She moved to the small basin in the corner and splashed water on her face, catching her reflection in the small, cracked mirror above it. High cheekbones, a straight nose, and deep blue eyes looked back at her. Her mother had called her handsome once, then immediately apologized as if it were an insult rather than a compliment. "Handsome is for men, pretty is for women," she'd explained, trying to soften her unintentional slight. Nora sighed and began the process of rebinding her thick auburn hair. Tomorrow she would meet the new blacksmith, a man who hadn't seemed put off by her height or her strength. A man whose eyes had looked directly into hers without discomfort or judgment, but experience had taught Nora caution. In a town like Hillsboro, where a woman's greatest virtue was her ability to conform, she was an oddity at best, a cautionary tale at worst. Grant Lawson would learn this soon enough, and his friendly demeanor would shift to the awkward politeness she'd grown accustomed to from men. She locked up the smithy and headed home, her long strides carrying her quickly through town. Women pulled their skirts aside as she passed, as if her difference might soil their fabric. Men nodded curtly, their eyes never quite meeting hers. Only old Mr. Jenkins, sitting on the porch of the general store, offered a genuine smile. "Heard you saved the day again, Nora girl," he called out. "Don't know what this town would do without you." Nora paused, returning his smile. "Evening, Mr. Jenkins. Just did what needed doing." "Always do, don't you?" the old man chuckled. "Saw you talking to our new smith. Seems a decent sort." "We'll see," Nora replied noncommittally. "Decent sorts have a way of changing their tune in these parts." The old man's eyes softened. "Not everyone's afraid of a woman who knows her own mind, girl. Some might even value it. When you find one, send him my way," Nora joked, continuing on her path. Her father was dozing in his chair when she entered the small but tidy house at the edge of town. Thomas Sullivan had once been as imposing a figure as his daughter, tall and broad-shouldered with hands that could bend iron to his will. Now, At 65, arthritis had twisted those magnificent hands into gnarled claws, and his once straight back was perpetually curved in pain. He stirred as she closed the door. "That you, Nora girl? It's me, Pa." She moved to the stove where a pot of stew had been simmering. "Hungry, always." He watched as she served up 2 bowls. Heard quite a commotion earlier. Stagecoach trouble. Nora set a bowl before him. Rattlesnake spooked the team. No harm done. Thomas studied his daughter's face. That all that happened today? She hesitated, then sat across from him. "New blacksmith rode into town. He's taking over Peterson's place." "Ah." Thomas slowly straightened in his chair. "Competition, is it?" "Hillsboro's growing. Plenty of work for 2 smiths." Nora stirred her stew, not meeting her father's eyes. "His name is Grant Lawson. Tall fellow, green eyes." Thomas chuckled. "Don't often hear you noticing a man's eyes, daughter." Nora felt her cheeks warm again. "He's coming by the smithy tomorrow to talk shop, that's all, of course." Her father's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Just business between colleagues." "Exactly," Nora said firmly, focusing on her meal. "Nothing more." But that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Nora found herself remembering the way Grant Lawson had looked at her, not as an oddity or a failure of womanhood, but as someone worth seeing. It was a dangerous feeling, this flicker of hope. Hope had sharp edges. It could cut you when it broke. Dawn found Nora already at the forge, stoking the fire to life. The rhythmic bellows movement was meditative, allowing her mind to settle into the coming day's work. She had a set of hinges to finish for the schoolhouse and 3 horses to shoe before noon. The work was physically demanding, but Nora loved how it required both strength and precision. Each strike of her hammer was purposeful, each piece she created both useful and, in its own way, beautiful. She was so absorbed in heating an iron bar that she didn't hear the approaching footsteps. Only when a shadow fell across her workspace did she look up to find Grant Lawson standing in the doorway, 2 steaming mugs in hand and an appreciative smile on his face. "Morning, Miss Sullivan," he said, offering one of the mugs. "Coffee, as promised." Nora set down her tongs and wiped her hands on her leather apron. "Mr. Lawson, you're punctual." "Grant, please." He handed her the coffee. "And I've found being on time is one of the few virtues I consistently manage." The coffee was strong and sweetened with just a touch of honey, exactly how Nora liked it, though she couldn't recall ever sharing this preference. She raised an eyebrow in question. Grant's smile widened. "Asked at the hotel what you might prefer. The cook seemed to know." "Mrs. Rivera has been feeding me since I was knee-high," Nora explained, touched by the thoughtfulness. "She probably knows my tastes better than I do." Grant leaned against the doorframe, taking in the workshop with obvious appreciation. "Fine setup you have here. Your father built it," Nora nodded. "Started from nothing when Hillsboro was just a few buildings and a lot of hope. Mining brought people, and people needed metal worked." She ran a hand along the solid workbench. "Pa taught me everything I know." "And how did that come about? Not many women take up the hammer." There was no judgment in his tone, just genuine curiosity, but Nora felt her guard rise nonetheless. She'd heard variations of this question throughout her life, usually followed by commentary on the inappropriateness of her occupation. "I was an only child," she said simply. "Pa needed help, and I was stronger than most boys my age. It just made sense." Grant nodded, his eyes moving to the pieces displayed around the shop hinges and latches of exceptional quality, horseshoes perfectly balanced, and more ornate items. Candlesticks with delicate scrollwork, a fire poker topped with an intricately worked hawk. "Beautiful work," he said, moving to examine a small iron rose that sat on a shelf. "This is extraordinary." Nora felt an unfamiliar flush of pride. Most people in town saw her work as merely functional, overlooking the artistry she poured into each piece. "Thank you. It's just a hobby piece." "You have an artist's touch." Grant set down the rose with care. "Makes me wonder if I've made a mistake coming to Hillsboro. Hard to compete with craftsmanship like this." "There's enough work," Nora assured him. "The mines are expanding and the town's growing faster than I can keep up." "What brings you to Hillsboro anyway? It's hardly the center of the territory." Grant sipped his coffee, considering her question. "Needed a fresh start. I was working a forge in Santa Fe, but the city was getting too crowded for my taste. Heard Hillsboro was booming but still had room to breathe." He met her eyes directly. "And I admit the idea of mountains and open country appealed." "You won't find a prettier place," Nora agreed. "Though winters can be harsh if you're not prepared. I'll keep that in mind." His gaze lingered on her face a moment longer than was strictly proper, causing an unusual flutter in Nora's chest. "Now, I was hoping you might show me Peterson's old place. I've purchased it sight unseen, which might not have been my wisest decision." Nora hesitated, glancing at the iron she'd been heating. "I have work to finish, but I can wait," Grant said easily, settling onto a stool, "or help if you'd allow it." The offer surprised her. Men in Hillsboro generally avoided her workspace, uncomfortable with the reversal of traditional roles. Even her father's old customers sometimes hesitated to give her their business, though they eventually relented when they saw the quality of her work. "You're welcome to watch," she said finally, returning to the forge. "But I work at my own pace." Grant made no move to leave his spot. "I'd expect nothing less." For the next hour, Nora worked as she always did, losing herself in the rhythm of heating, hammering, and shaping metal. Occasionally, she'd glance up to find Grant watching her with undisguised admiration, his eyes following her movements with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. When she finally completed the set of hinges, sliding them into a cooling bath with a satisfying hiss, she looked up to find him still sitting patiently, an expression of respect clear on his face. "That was something to see," he said quietly. "You have a gift, Miss Sullivan." "Nora," she corrected him, surprising herself. "If I'm to call you Grant, then fair's fair." His smile broadened. "Nora it is." She removed her heavy apron and hung it on its peg. "Shall we go see what you've bought yourself, Grant?" They walked side by side through Hillsboro's Main Street, an unusual sight that drew stares from townsfolk going about their morning business. Nora was accustomed to the looks, the mixture of curiosity, disapproval, and sometimes pity, but today they seemed more pronounced. A woman of her stature walking alongside a man who was nearly her match in height, both of them wearing work clothes and talking animatedly about metallurgy and forge techniques, was not something Hillsboro saw every day. Old Man Peterson's blacksmith shop sat at the opposite end of town from Nora's, a strategic placement that had allowed both businesses to thrive when Peterson was still working. The building had stood empty for nearly a year since Peterson had moved to California to live with his daughter, and it showed signs of neglect: broken windows, a sagging door, and a roof that had seen better days. Grant surveyed his purchase with hands on his hips. "Well, it needs work, but the bones seem good," Nora nodded. "Peterson built it solid. It's just been sitting too long." She pointed to the collapsed lean-to at the side. "That's where he kept his coal. You'll want to rebuild that before the rainy season. Would you mind taking a look inside?" "I'd value your opinion on what needs immediate attention." The interior was dusty but intact. The forge itself would need a thorough cleaning, and several tools had rusted from disuse, but overall, the space was workable. Nora moved through it with the eye of someone who understood exactly what a blacksmith required, pointing out issues and suggesting solutions. The chimney needs sweeping before you light your first fire, she noted, peering up at the soot-caked flue. And these bellows have dry rot. You'll want new ones. Grant watched her as she assessed his new workspace, taking note of each recommendation. You know, in most towns, the established blacksmith would be trying to run me out, not helping me set up shop. Nora glanced at him over her shoulder. Would you prefer that? I could start spreading rumors about your shoddy workmanship if it would make you feel more at home. His laugh was unexpected and genuine, filling the dusty space with warmth. No, I much prefer this arrangement. He stepped closer, his expression turning serious. But it does make me curious. Why are you helping your competition? Nora considered the question, leaning against the cold forge. Hillsboro needs 2 blacksmiths. I've been turning away work for months. And she hesitated, then decided on honesty. I've had enough of people in this town looking at me sideways. If having another smith means I can focus on the work I prefer and avoid some of those stares, all the better. Grant's eyes softened. People fear what they don't understand, and a woman who doesn't fit their narrow definition of womanhood scares them something fierce. You don't seem scared, Nora observed. Should I be? A half-smile played on his lips. According to half the women in town, I'm one step away from growing a beard and taking up pipe smoking. Grant laughed again, the sound bright and genuine. Well, I don't see any stubble, and you smell considerably better than tobacco. He took another step toward her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. What I do see is a skilled artisan who happens to be a striking woman. The compliment landed like a physical touch, warming places in Nora that had long gone cold. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, especially not from a man who looked at her as if her height and strength were assets rather than flaws. Mr. Lawson, are you flirting with me? The question slipped out before she could stop it, direct as always. Trying to, he admitted with a sheepish grin. Not doing a very good job of it, I suppose. Nora felt a smile tugging at her lips despite her efforts to remain impassive. I wouldn't know. No one's tried before. Something like surprise, followed quickly by disbelief, crossed Grant's features. That, Miss Sullivan, is the most ridiculous thing I've heard since arriving in this town. Before Nora could respond, the door to the shop swung open and Mrs. Pemberton stood framed in the dusty sunlight, her expression shifting from determination to shock, as she took in the scene before her. Nora and Grant standing close together in the empty shop. Something indefinable passing between them. Mr. Lawson, Mrs. Pemberton's voice was pitched higher than usual. I've been looking all over for you. The town council is meeting this afternoon and would very much like to welcome you officially. Her eyes flicked to Nora with barely disguised disapproval. I'm sure Miss Sullivan has her own work to attend to. The spell broken, Nora stepped back and nodded. Indeed I do. 3 horses waiting to be shod. She moved toward the door, pausing only briefly beside the older woman. Good day, Mrs. Pemberton. Grant followed her to the door. Thank you for your help, Nora. Perhaps we could continue our professional discussion over dinner sometime. Mrs. Pemberton made a small choking sound behind them. Nora hesitated, acutely aware of the older woman's scandalized presence. A dinner invitation was a bold move in a town like Hillsboro, where courtships were carefully orchestrated affairs, usually beginning with chaperoned meetings and proceeding at a glacial pace toward marriage. For an unmarried man and woman to dine alone would set tongues wagging from the saloon to the church steps, but something in Grant's steady gaze made her straighten her spine and nod. I'd like that. Excellent. Tomorrow evening. I understand the hotel serves a decent steak. 7 o'clock, Nora agreed, stepping out into the sunlight with her head held high, ignoring Mrs. Pemberton's audible gasp. As she walked back to her own smithy, Nora's mind whirled with the morning's events. Grant Lawson was unlike any man she'd ever met direct, unintimidated by her strength or height, and apparently interested in her as a woman. The possibility was so foreign that she hardly knew what to make of it. She had just reached her workshop when she heard her name called in a familiar, disapproving tone. "Nora Sullivan, what in heaven's name do you think you're doing?" Nora turned to find Mrs. Abigail Wright, her mother's oldest friend and Hillsboro's most dedicated gossip, bearing down on her with the righteous indignation of a preacher at a saloon door. "Good morning, Mrs. Wright. I'm working same as every day. Don't you play innocent with me, young lady." Abigail's thin face was flushed with the excitement of fresh scandal. "I just heard from Ethel Pemberton that you were alone with that new blacksmith in Peterson's old shop, and that he asked you to dinner." She lowered her voice to a dramatic whisper. "Unchaperoned dinner." Nora sighed, knowing that news traveled faster than a prairie fire in Hillsboro. "That's correct. But what will people say? A respectable woman doesn't, with all due respect, Mrs. Right," Nora interrupted, her patience wearing thin. "I stopped worrying about what people in this town would say when I was 16 and grew taller than every boy in school. They've been talking about me my whole life, and I expect they'll continue long after I'm gone." Abigail drew herself up, affronted. "Your poor mother would be turning in her grave. She tried so hard to raise you properly despite your unfortunate tendencies." The mention of her mother stung, as it always did. Caroline Sullivan had been a petite, gentle woman, who had never quite understood how she'd produced a daughter who towered over her by the age of 13. She'd loved Nora fiercely, but had spent most of her daughter's adolescence trying desperately to mold her into something she could never be: delicate, demure, desirable by the standards of the day. "My mother wanted me to be happy," Nora said quietly. "And for once I think I might have a chance at that. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have horses waiting." She turned and entered her workshop, closing the door firmly behind her. The familiar smells of coal, iron, and leather enveloped her, bringing a measure of calm. Here, in this space, she was defined by her skill and strength, not by how well she conformed to others' expectations. The rest of the day passed in a blur of work shoeing horses, repairing a broken wagon axle, crafting nails for the expanding schoolhouse. Nora lost herself in the rhythm of it, but thoughts of Grant Lawson kept intruding. His easy smile, the respect in his eyes when he watched her work, the way he seemed completely unfazed by her unconventional nature, all of it was as confusing as it was exhilarating. By the time she closed up the smithy and headed home, the sun was setting, painting Hillsboro in shades of gold and amber. Her father was sitting on their small porch, his twisted hands resting on a walking stick, his face tilted toward the fading light. "There you are," he said as she approached. "Beginning to think you decided to sleep at the forge. Nearly did." Nora sat beside him, the porch step creaking under her weight. "Busy day." Thomas studied his daughter's face. "Heard you've been making new friends," Nora snorted softly. "Mrs. Wright, among others." He shifted, grimacing slightly as his joints protested. "Whole town's abuzz with the news that the new blacksmith has taken a shine to our Nora." "The whole town needs a hobby," she muttered. Thomas chuckled. "They've got one watching other people's business." His weathered face grew serious. "This Lawson fellow, he treating you proper?" Nora thought of the way Grant had looked at her, really looked at her without flinching away from her height or strength. "He's different, Pa. Doesn't seem bothered by what bothers most men." "And what's that?" "Me." The word came out smaller than she intended. "All of me." Thomas reached over with a gnarled hand and covered hers. "Then he's a smarter man than most in this town." He squeezed gently. Your mother worried so about you, you know. Not because she wanted to change you, but because she knew the world can be cruel to those who don't fit its mold. She spent most of my growing years trying to make me smaller, Nora reminded him, old hurt creeping into her voice. More delicate, more acceptable. She spent most of your growing years terrified that the world would hurt you for being exactly who you are, Thomas corrected gently. She didn't have the words to explain it right, and maybe she went about it wrong, but her heart was in the right place. Nora leaned her head against her father's shoulder, a position that had been uncomfortable since she'd outgrown him at 17. I miss her. Every day, Thomas agreed. She'd have liked to see you happy, though, even if it scandalized half of Hillsboro. Only half. Nora smiled against his shoulder. Well, the other half's already scandalized by you shoeing their horses better than any man could, so this'll just give him something new to talk about. They sat in companionable silence as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear. Finally, Nora stood and helped her father to his feet. Come on, old man. Time to feed you. As they entered their small home, Nora couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. For the first time in years, she felt a flutter of something like hope, dangerous, fragile hope that perhaps there was room in this world for a woman like her to be not just tolerated, but desired, valued, even loved. The following evening found Nora standing before the small mirror in her bedroom, scrutinizing her reflection with uncommon attention. She'd bathed thoroughly, scrubbing away the day's soot and sweat, and had put on her best dress, a deep blue cotton that her mother had made for her 20th birthday, one of the few garments she owned that actually fit her properly. The color brought out the deep blue of her eyes, a feature her mother had always insisted was her prettiest. Her thick auburn hair was freshly washed and pinned up, though several wayward curls had already escaped to frame her face. Nora tucked them behind her ears, then changed her mind and let them be. What was the point of trying to tame what couldn't be tamed? Her father knocked softly on her door. You about ready, girl? Sun's nearly down. Nora opened the door to find Thomas leaning on his cane, a twinkle in his eye as he took in the sight of his daughter in her best dress. Well now, he said with a low whistle. Aren't you a picture? Nora smoothed the fabric of her skirt self-consciously. Do I look ridiculous? It's been so long since I wore anything but work clothes. You look beautiful, Thomas said firmly. Like your mother, God rest her soul, but with my height, he winked. Poor man won't know what hit him. Nora rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a smile. It's just dinner, Pa. Don't go planning the wedding yet. Wouldn't dream of it. Thomas stepped aside to let her pass. Though I will say, any man who appreciates you as you are is already leagues ahead of the fools in this town. The walk to the hotel took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like one of the longest journeys of Nora's life. She could feel eyes on her as she passed, curtains twitching, conversations pausing, heads turning to track her progress. Word of her dinner engagement with Grant Lawson had clearly spread throughout Hillsboro, and the entire town seemed to be holding its collective breath to see what would happen. The hotel dining room was moderately busy when she arrived, mostly with traveling salesmen and the occasional rancher in town on business. Conversations faltered as she entered, then resumed in a lower, more speculative tone. Nora lifted her chin and scanned the room, spotting Grant at a corner table. He rose as she approached, and Nora was struck again by how tall he was, not quite her height, but close enough that she didn't have to look down to meet his eyes. You came, he said, a note of pleasant surprise in his voice, as if he'd half expected her to change her mind. I said I would, Nora replied simply. Grant pulled out her chair, a gesture so unexpected that Nora hesitated before sitting. Few men in Hillsboro bothered with such courtesies toward her, as if her height and strength exempted her from the gentler treatment they afforded other women. "You look lovely," Grant said as he took his own seat. "That color suits you." Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Thank you. It's not often I have occasion to wear anything but work clothes." "A shame. Though I must admit, you cut quite a figure in your blacksmith's apron as well." The waiter approached, a young man named Billy who had once asked Nora to a dance, years ago, only to withdraw the invitation when his friends mocked him for choosing a partner who would tower over him. Now he shifted awkwardly from foot to foot, avoiding her eyes as he recited the evening's offerings. "The steak, please," Nora said, determined to enjoy her meal despite the stares burning into her back from the other diners. "And coffee." "The same," Grant added, his eyes never leaving Nora's face. When Billy retreated, he leaned forward slightly. "So, I've been in Hillsboro 3 days now, and I've already gathered that you're something of a local legend." Nora tensed. "Oh, The way I hear it, you've saved at least 3 children from drowning in the creek, stopped a runaway stagecoach single-handedly, and can bend horseshoes with your bare hands." His eyes twinkled with amusement. "The last one seems a waste of good craftsmanship, but I'm impressed nonetheless." Nora relaxed slightly at his teasing tone. "People exaggerate. I did pull a child from the creek once, hardly heroic when you consider I can touch the bottom where most can't. The stagecoach you saw yourself, and I've never bent a perfectly good horseshoe just to show off." She paused. "Though I could if I wanted to," Grant laughed, the sound drawing even more stares from the surrounding tables. "I don't doubt it for a moment." He settled back in his chair, regarding her with genuine curiosity. "It must have been interesting growing up here, being as exceptional as you are." "Interesting is one word for it," Nora said dryly. "Excruciating might be another." "Tell me." The simple request, spoken with what seemed like sincere interest, caught Nora off guard. Men rarely asked about her experiences, especially not the painful ones. But something in Grant's steady gaze encouraged honesty. "I was always tall for my age," she began hesitantly. "But around 12 I just kept growing when the other girls stopped. By 14 I was taller than every boy in school and stronger too. My mother was beside herself, kept trying to teach me to make myself smaller, to round my shoulders and take tiny steps and speak softly." Nora shook her head at the memory. "But it was like trying to stuff a mountain lion into a butter churn. I was what I was." "And what was that?" Grant prompted gently. Nora met his eyes directly. "Too much. Too tall, too strong, too loud, too opinionated, not pretty enough, not gentle enough, not feminine enough." She shrugged, the motion carrying more resignation than acceptance. "The boys were scared of me, and the girls didn't know what to make of me. By the time I was 18, it was clear I wasn't going to be anybody's wife, so I became my father's apprentice instead." Billy returned with their steaks, setting them down quickly before scurrying away again. Grant waited until they were alone to continue. "And you never regretted that choice, taking up the hammer instead of, learning to embroider cushions and bake pies?" Nora cut into her steak, considering the question. "I can bake a decent pie, actually. And I've tried my hand at embroidery, though my fingers are too calloused for fine needlework now." She set down her knife and looked at him directly. "But no, I don't regret it. Working the forge, it feels right in a way nothing else ever has, like I was made for it." "From what I've seen of your work, you were," Grant agreed. "But it couldn't have been easy breaking that particular barrier." "It wasn't." Nora remembered the early days after her father's arthritis had forced him to step back when customers would arrive, take one look at her standing by the forge, and turn around without a word. "Lost a lot of business at first." Some men would rather ride 20 miles to the next town than have a woman shoe their horses. But good work speaks for itself eventually. Those that couldn't accept it took their business elsewhere. The rest learned to tolerate me. Tolerate? Grant raised an eyebrow. Seems to me they should be grateful to have an artisan of your caliber in their midst. Nora felt that unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest again. No one, save her father, had ever spoken of her work with such open admiration. "You're very kind, Mr. Lawson." "Grant," he corrected gently. "And it's not kindness to state facts." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the rich flavors of the steak a welcome change from Nora's usual simple cooking. She was acutely aware of the continued glances from other diners, but for once, they didn't prickle against her skin like nettles. Something about Grant's steady presence across the table made the stares easier to ignore. "What about you?" she asked finally. "You said you needed a fresh start in Hillsboro. Why is that?" Grant's expression shifted, a shadow passing briefly over his features. "A long story and not a particularly pleasant one for dinner conversation." "I told you mine," Nora pointed out. "Fair's fair." He smiled at her directness. "So it is." He set down his fork and sighed. "I was engaged to be married in Santa Fe. Catherine was. Everything a gentleman could want in a wife. Beautiful, accomplished, from a good family." He paused, his gaze distant. The wedding was set for spring. But then her brother was killed in a barroom brawl and everything changed. Grant's jaw tightened at the memory. The man who killed him was a local tough, known for picking fights. Catherine's father demanded justice, but the killer had friends in high places. The territorial judge dismissed the case self-defense, he ruled, though everyone knew better. Nora watched his face, seeing the pain etched in the lines around his eyes. "What did you do?" "What any man with fire in his blood would do. I confronted him." Grant's hand tightened around his coffee cup. "It was stupid, impulsive. He drew on me. I was faster." He looked up, meeting Nora's eyes directly. "I killed him. It was ruled self-defense. He drew first, and there were witnesses, but the damage was done. Catherine's family blamed you." Grant nodded. "They didn't want more bloodshed," they said, "didn't want vengeance, just wanted to bury their son and move on." His voice hardened. "Catherine broke our engagement, said she couldn't bear to look at me without seeing her brother's killer." "That's not fair," Nora said softly. "You were defending yourself. Life rarely is fair." Grant's smile was tight but genuine. "I stayed in Santa Fe for a few months, but everywhere I went, people whispered. The blacksmith who killed a man. Eventually, I decided a fresh start was in order." He gestured around the dining room. "And here I am, telling my darkest secrets to the most fascinating woman I've ever met." The compliment caught Nora by surprise, warming her from the inside out. "Hardly fascinating, just unusual." "Unusual is merely another word for exceptional," Grant countered. "And you, Nora Sullivan, are exceptional in every way that matters." The rest of dinner passed in a comfortable flow of conversation. Grant told stories of his apprenticeship in Chicago, his journey west as a young man seeking his fortune, and his years in Santa Fe. Nora shared tales of Hillsboro's early days as seen through a child's eyes, her father's tutelage at the forge, and her own struggles and triumphs as a female blacksmith. By the time they finished their coffee, the dining room had nearly emptied, and the manager was giving them pointed looks. "I believe we're overstaying our welcome," Grant observed with a rueful smile. "May I walk you home?" Outside, the night was clear and cool, stars scattered across the black canvas of sky like spilled diamonds. They walked side by side, close but not touching, their steps naturally falling into rhythm despite the difference in their heights. The streets of Hillsboro were quiet now, most respectable folk already tucked behind their curtained windows. "I've enjoyed this evening," Grant said as they approached the Sullivan home. "More than I expected to, if I'm being honest." Nora glanced at him. "Did you think it would be terrible?" "I thought you might spend the entire meal glaring at me suspiciously," he admitted with a laugh. "You have a rather formidable stare, Miss Sullivan." "Years of practice," she replied with a small smile. "Men tend to take a woman more seriously when she looks like she might throw them through a wall if provoked." They reached her gate, and Nora turned to face him, suddenly uncertain. She'd never been courted, never stood at her own gate in the moonlight with a man looking at her the way Grant was looking at her now, as if she were something precious and rare. "Thank you for dinner," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "Thank you for your company." Grant stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'd very much like to see you again, Nora. Perhaps I could call on you Sunday after church." The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities. Calling on a woman after church was a public declaration of intent in a town like Hillsboro. It would make whatever was growing between them official, open to scrutiny and gossip. "People will talk," Nora warned him. Grant smiled, a slow, warm curve of lips that made her heart stutter. "Let them. I've never much cared for other people's opinions." "You might care when they start saying you've lost your mind, courting the giant blacksmith woman." "The only opinion I care about is yours." Grant's voice dropped lower, intimate in the quiet night. "So, what do you say? May I call on you Sunday?" Nora took a deep breath, feeling as though she stood on the edge of a cliff, preparing to leap into unknown waters. "Yes," she said finally. "I'd like that." Grant's smile widened. Slowly, telegraphing his intent, he reached for her hand. His fingers were as calloused as her own, warm and strong as they closed around hers. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving her face. "Until Sunday, then," he said softly, releasing her hand and stepping back. Nora could still feel the warmth of his lips on her skin as she watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the darkness. She stood at the gate long after he'd gone, staring up at the stars, wondering if she was dreaming. The sound of the front door opening broke her reverie. Her father stood silhouetted in the doorway, his walking stick tapping impatiently against the wooden floor. "You planning to spend the night in the garden, girl?" he called. Nora laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. "Coming, Pa." Inside, Thomas settled into his chair by the fire, his knowing eyes following Nora as she moved about the room. "Good evening, was it?" It was. Nora searched for a word that could encompass the newness, the wonder of being seen and appreciated just as she was. "Pleasant," she finished lamely. Thomas snorted. "Pleasant, she says. Girl comes home with stars in her eyes and calls it pleasant." He shook his head in mock despair. "Your mother would have had the whole story by now, with every detail of what he said and how he looked when he said it." Nora smiled, remembering her mother's enthusiasm for romantic tales. "He asked if he could call on me Sunday after church." Thomas's eyebrows shot up. "Did he now? Moving quickly, isn't he?" "Is it too quick?" Nora suddenly felt uncertain. Her inexperience in matters of courtship left her with no reference point for what was proper or expected, not if his intentions are honorable. Thomas studied his daughter's face. "Are they?" "I believe so," Nora said slowly. "He's different, Pa. He looks at me and sees me, not just a curiosity or an oddity." Thomas nodded, satisfaction evident in his weathered features. "Good. That's as it should be." He gestured for her to come closer, and when she knelt beside his chair, he placed a gnarled hand on her cheek. "You deserve to be cherished, my girl. Never settle for less." Nora leaned into her father's touch, grateful for his steady presence, his unwavering belief in her worth. "I won't, Pa, I promise." That night, as Nora prepared for bed, she found herself moving with a newfound awareness of her body. For so long, she had viewed her height and strength as obstacles to overcome, attributes to minimize or apologize for. But tonight, remembering the admiration in Grant's eyes as he watched her work, the way he'd matched her stride without comment, the respect in his voice when he spoke of her craft, she wondered if perhaps her difference wasn't a flaw at all, but simply a part of who she was meant to be. She stood before her small mirror, really looking at herself perhaps for the first time. Tall, yes. Strong, undeniably. But also graceful in her own way, with a face that, while not conventionally pretty, had character: high cheekbones, expressive blue eyes, a determined chin. Her mother had called her handsome once, and perhaps that was right. Handsome like a well-crafted tool, form perfectly matched to function. For the first time in her life, Nora went to sleep without wishing to wake up smaller, gentler, more like other women. Instead, she dreamed of green eyes and calloused hands, and of being exactly who she was, without apology. The following days passed in a blur of work and anticipation. Nora threw herself into her craft with renewed energy, completing commissions that had lingered half-finished for weeks. Several times, she looked up from her forge to find Grant passing by, ostensibly on business, but always with time to stop for a few minutes of conversation. Each brief encounter left Nora feeling lighter, more alive. Grant asked questions about her techniques, admired her work without condescension, and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. It was a novel experience, being treated as an equal by a man who wasn't her father. By Sunday morning, the entire town was abuzz with speculation. Nora could feel the weight of stares as she and her father entered the small church, the whispers that followed her to their usual pew near the back. Grant was already seated on the opposite side of the aisle, and he stood respectfully as they passed, offering a warm smile that Nora couldn't help but return. Reverend Matthews chose that day, of all days, to preach on the virtues of a godly woman, quoting at length from Proverbs about gentle spirits and submissive hearts. Nora kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her face carefully neutral, though she could feel her father's hand tightening sympathetically over hers. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the bright New Mexico sunshine, Nora steeled herself for what was to come. This would be the most public declaration possible in Hillsboro. Grant Lawson, newly arrived and already respected for his craft, walking home from church with the town's most controversial woman. She needn't have worried. Grant approached them directly, nodding respectfully to Thomas before turning his attention to Nora. "Miss Sullivan," he said formally, conscious of the eyes upon them. "Mr. Sullivan, fine sermon today." Thomas snorted softly. "If you say so, young man," seemed a bit pointed to my ear. Grant's lips twitched. Perhaps the Reverend feels his flock needs guidance on certain matters. His eyes met Nora's, warm with unspoken understanding. "May I have the honor of walking you both home?" And just like that, with Thomas's gruff blessing, Grant fell into step beside Nora, offering his arm as naturally as if they'd been walking together for years. After a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand in the crook of his elbow, acutely aware of the gasps and murmurs from the church steps behind them. "You've caused quite a stir," Thomas observed dryly as they proceeded down Hillsboro's Main Street. "Mrs. Wright looks like she's about to faint dead away." Grant glanced back at the gathering of wide-eyed townsfolk. "Good. Might give them something to discuss besides the weather for once." Thomas chuckled. "Oh, they've had plenty to discuss in this town, most of it concerning my daughter. But I suspect you're about to provide them with fresh material for years to come." The walk home was pleasant despite the scrutiny. with Grant and Thomas falling into easy conversation about the territorial governor's latest policies and their potential impact on small towns like Hillsboro. Nora mostly listened, content to observe the easy rapport developing between the two men, and to enjoy the novel sensation of walking arm in arm with someone who seemed proud rather than embarrassed to be seen with her. At the Sullivan home, Thomas made a show of remembering an urgent matter he needed to discuss with Reverend Matthews, and with a wink at Nora that was anything but subtle, he announced his intention to return to town. "Don't wait dinner on me," he called over his shoulder as he set off back the way they'd come. "Might be some time." Left alone on the small front porch, Nora and Grant shared an amused glance. "Subtle as a blacksmith's hammer, your father," Grant observed. "He's never had much use for pretense," Nora agreed, leading the way to the pair of rocking chairs that had been her mother's pride and joy. "Please sit." Grant settled into the chair beside her, his long legs stretching out comfortably. For a while they simply rocked in companionable silence, watching the distant mountains shimmer in the midday heat. "Your father seems pleased about." Grant gestured between them. "This. He worries about me," Nora admitted. "What will happen to me when he's gone? The smithy provides a living, but it's a solitary life." "And is that what you want? A solitary life?" Nora considered the question, her eyes on the distant horizon. "I never thought I had much choice in the matter. Men in these parts have certain expectations of a wife: small, delicate, obedient. I'm none of those things." "Thank God for that," Grant said fervently. Nora turned to look at him, surprised by the conviction in his voice. "I've known delicate women," Grant continued. "Catherine was one, beautiful and fragile as porcelain, but when life dealt her a harsh blow, she shattered." His eyes held Nora's steadily. "You're different. You're forged steel, beautiful in your own way, but strong, resilient, able to withstand the heat and pressure that would break others." The words settled around Nora like a warm cloak, fitting more comfortably than any compliment she'd ever received. "Most men don't want steel, they want porcelain." "Most men are fools," Grant replied simply. He reached across the space between their chairs, his hand open in invitation. "I've never much cared for fragile things. They require too much caution, too much worry. I prefer strength, solidity. A woman who can stand beside me, not behind me." Slowly, Nora placed her hand in his, marveling at how right it felt, her calloused palm against his, strength meeting equal strength. "I should warn you," she said quietly. "I have no idea how to be courted, what to say, how to act." Grant's fingers tightened around hers. "Be exactly as you are. That's all I want." The weeks that followed were unlike anything Nora had ever experienced. Grant called on her regularly, sometimes for dinner at the hotel, sometimes for walks along the creek that ran behind town, sometimes just to sit on her porch and talk as the sun set. Each encounter was marked by the same easy conversation and growing affection, a sense of rightness that Nora had never expected to find. The town's reaction was predictable. Some, like Mrs. Wright and Mrs. Pemberton, viewed the courtship with open disapproval, their pinched expressions suggesting that Grant must be somehow deficient in judgment or eyesight to prefer Nora over the more traditionally feminine women of Hillsboro. Others, particularly the younger folk, found the romance intriguing, even inspiring. Nora noticed several of the town's taller girls suddenly standing straighter, as if her unexpected happiness had granted them permission to take up more space in the world. Grant, for his part, seemed utterly unconcerned with public opinion. He continued to establish his business at the old Peterson Forge, quickly developing a reputation for quality work and fair prices. Sometimes he and Nora would collaborate on larger projects, their complementary skills producing pieces finer than either could create alone. It was during one such collaboration, nearly a month into their courtship, that Nora realized she was falling in love. They were crafting an elaborate gate for the new bank building, their separate forges blazing as they worked on different elements of the design. Grant had created delicate scrollwork that would frame the top of the gate, while Nora focused on the sturdy hinges and locking mechanism. As they brought their pieces together, fitting them with the precision of craftsmen who understood each other's work implicitly, Nora felt a surge of something powerful and unfamiliar. It wasn't just respect for his skill, or attraction to the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt as he worked. It was a deeper recognition, a sense that they were somehow forged from the same metal, tempered by different experiences but fundamentally matched. Grant must have felt something similar, for he set down his tools and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Nora," he said, her name almost a prayer on his lips. "I need to tell you something." She set down her hammer, heart suddenly pounding harder than it had all day despite the physical labor. "What is it?" Grant stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the familiar scent of smoke and iron that clung to them both. "I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, simple and direct and terrifying in their honesty. Nora felt as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly shifted, leaving her unbalanced for the first time since she'd taken up the blacksmith's hammer. "You can't know that," she said, the words barely above a whisper. "It's too soon." "I've known it since the day I watched you stop that stagecoach," Grant replied, his voice steady and sure. "I just needed time to be certain it wasn't merely admiration or attraction speaking." He reached up, his fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "But it's more than that. It's everything about you, your strength, your determination, your skill, your kindness, the way you care for your father, the way you face this town's judgment with your head high." Nora felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, unfamiliar and unwelcome. She'd learned long ago not to cry, especially not in front of others. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Grant assured her, his hand dropping back to his side. "I just wanted you to know where I stand, what I feel. I'll wait as long as you need to be sure of your own heart." Nora looked at this man who had upended her carefully ordered existence, who had seen her strength as an asset rather than a liability, who looked at her as if she were everything he'd ever wanted. And suddenly, she knew her own mind with the same clarity she felt at her forge. "I don't need to wait," she said, straightening to her full height and meeting his gaze directly. "I love you too, Grant. I think I have since you looked up at me that first day and weren't afraid of what you saw." Joy blazed across Grant's face, as bright and transformative as the sun breaking through storm clouds. "Nora Sullivan," he said, stepping even closer. "May I kiss you?" She nodded, words momentarily beyond her as Grant reached up, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that belied their strength. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he drew her down to meet him. Their lips met in a kiss that started soft and tentative but quickly deepened, years of loneliness and longing giving way to newfound passion. Nora's arms went around him, drawing him closer, marveling at how perfectly they fit together despite their differences. When they finally parted, both breathless, Grant rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the day we met." Nora smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Why didn't you?" "I was building up my courage," he admitted with a grin. "You're a formidable woman, Nora Sullivan. A man needs to be sure of his footing before he leaps." She laughed, the sound echoing through the smithy. "And now, are you sure of your footing?" Grant's eyes grew serious again. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." He took her hands in his thumbs tracing the calluses on her palms. "I want to build a life with you, Nora, a partnership of equals. I know it's soon, and I'm not asking for an answer now, but I want you to know that's where my heart is leading me." The words settled around Nora like a blessing, filling spaces within her that she hadn't known were empty. For so long, she had accepted that certain dreams weren't meant for women like her, too tall, too strong, too different to ever fit the mold of wife and mother. But standing here with Grant, his hands warm around hers and his eyes full of love and respect, she began to believe that perhaps those dreams could be hers after all. "I want that too," she said softly, "but there's something you should know first." She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what needed to be said. "If we were to marry, people would talk. More than they already do. They'd say you settled for less than you deserved, that you could have had any normal-sized, properly feminine woman in the territory." Grant's expression hardened. "I don't give a damn what they say." "You say that now," Nora persisted. "But words have power, Grant. They seep in. And one day you might look at me and wonder if they're right, if you could have had something easier." Grant was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. Then, deliberately, he knelt before her, still holding her hands in his. "Nora Sullivan," he said, his voice steady and clear in the quiet smithy. "I've traveled half this country, met women of every type and temperament, and never found anyone who makes me feel the way you do. You think I want easy. I want real. I want a woman who matches me in strength and spirit, who challenges me, who stands tall and proud exactly as she is." He squeezed her hands gently. "I'm not asking you to be less. I'm asking for the privilege of standing beside you exactly as you are for the rest of our lives." Tears spilled freely down Nora's cheeks now, years of hurt and doubt washing away in their wake. "Then yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll build that life with you." Grant rose to his feet, his smile brighter than the forge fire. This time when they kissed, it was a promise sealed in something stronger than iron, a love forged in mutual respect and understanding, tempered by the knowledge that they had found in each other something rare and precious. News of their engagement spread through Hillsboro faster than a prairie fire. By supper time, it seemed the entire town knew that Grant Lawson had proposed to Nora Sullivan in the middle of her smithy. With both of them covered in soot and sweat, hardly the romantic scene most young ladies dreamed of, but perfectly suited to the couple in question. The reactions were as varied as they were predictable. Thomas Sullivan received the news with quiet satisfaction, clasping Grant's hand with his gnarled fingers and saying simply, "About time you made an honest woman of my daughter, Mrs." Wright and her circle viewed the engagement with poorly disguised horror, their whispered conversations speculating on what could possibly drive a handsome, successful man like Grant to tie himself to a woman who stood eye to eye with him and could probably best him in a wrestling match. The younger folk of Hillsboro, however, seemed genuinely pleased for the unlikely couple. Sally Jenkins, the stagecoach driver's daughter who had always been self-conscious about her height, approached Nora after church the following Sunday. "I just wanted to say congratulations, Miss Sullivan," she said shyly. "And thank you." Nora looked at the girl in surprise. "Thank me? For what?" Sally blushed, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "For showing that being different doesn't mean being alone. My ma's always saying I'll never find a husband 'cause I'm too gangly, but seeing you with Mr. Lawson, well, it gives a girl hope." Nora felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense that perhaps her years of standing out, of being the odd one, had served some greater purpose after all. "You'll find someone who values you exactly as you are, Sally. Don't ever make yourself smaller to fit someone else's expectations." The girl nodded, a new determination in her young face, and Nora watched her walk away with straighter shoulders than before. The weeks that followed were filled with preparations for a wedding unlike any Hillsboro had seen. Nora, who had never imagined herself as a bride, suddenly found herself contemplating dresses and flowers and all the trappings of a proper ceremony. It was her father who finally cut through her uncharacteristic indecision. "Your mother would want you to have a proper wedding," he said one evening as Nora pored over fabric swatches. "But she'd want it to be yours, not what others think it should be." Nora looked up, grateful for his insight. "What do you think she would say, Pa, about all of this?" Thomas's weathered face softened with memory. "She'd say that love finds its own way and that a woman's worth isn't measured by how small she can make herself, but by how fully she lives her truth." He reached across the table to cover her hand with his. "And she'd be so proud of the woman you've become, Nora, as proud as I am." With her father's words to guide her, Nora embraced the wedding preparations with newfound confidence. She commissioned a dress that honored her height and strength, rather than trying to disguise them, a simple gown of ivory silk that followed the lines of her tall frame without apology. She would carry wildflowers from the hills around Hillsboro, rather than hothouse blooms imported from back east. And the ceremony would take place not in the church, with its too low ceiling and narrow pews, but in the open air of the town square, under the vast New Mexico sky that had witnessed her growth from awkward girl to confident woman. Grant, for his part, threw himself into preparing their future home. He had purchased a piece of land just outside town, with a view of the mountains and enough space for both a comfortable house and a shared workshop where they could ply their trade side by side. With help from friends and neighbors, even some who had once whispered behind Nora's back, but now seemed won over by the obvious devotion between the couple, he built a house designed for people of height, with high ceilings, door frames that wouldn't require ducking, and furniture scaled to fit their frames. The day before the wedding, Nora stood in the nearly completed house, running her hand along a kitchen counter built higher than was standard, marveling at the thought that had gone into every detail. "You like it?" Grant asked, watching her from the doorway. "I tried to think of everything that would make it comfortable for us both." Nora turned to him, her heart so full it felt as if it might burst from her chest. "It's perfect. I've spent my whole life stooping and bending and trying to fit into spaces too small for me. This feels like finally being able to stand up straight." Grant crossed the room and took her in his arms, his eyes serious as they met hers. "That's all I want for you, Nora. For us. A life where we can both stand tall together." She leaned down slightly to press her forehead against his, a gesture that had become natural between them. "I never thought I'd find this. Someone who sees me exactly as I am and doesn't wish for something different." "I wouldn't change a single thing about you," Grant said softly. "Not an inch of your height or an ounce of your strength." He smiled, the corner of his mouth quirking up in the way that never failed to make her heart skip. "Though I will admit, I'm grateful for these 3 inches I have on you when you're not wearing boots. Makes kissing you a bit easier." Nora laughed and demonstrated just how easy it could be, her arms going around his neck as she claimed his lips with her own. Their kisses had grown more confident over the weeks of their engagement, each one a promise of the life they would soon share. When they parted, Grant kept his arms around her waist. "One more day," he murmured. "One more day and you'll be my wife." "And you'll be my husband," Nora marveled, still sometimes unable to believe that this man, this life, could truly be hers. "No turning back now, Mr. Lawson. You're stuck with the tallest bride Hillsboro has ever seen." "The most beautiful bride Hillsboro has ever seen," Grant corrected, his eyes warm with affection. And I'm the luckiest man in the territory." They stood together in the home they had built, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through windows designed to frame the mountains beyond. In that moment, Nora felt a peace she had never known before, the peace of being exactly where and who she was meant to be, with someone who treasured rather than tolerated her differences. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the October sky a brilliant blue that seemed to reflect Nora's own joy back at her. In the small bedroom of her father's house, she stood before the mirror in her wedding gown, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. Gone was the perpetual furrow between her brows, the defensive set of her shoulders. In their place was a quiet confidence, a serene acceptance of her own beauty, not despite her height and strength, but because of them. A knock at the door announced her father, dressed in his best suit, his white hair neatly combed. He paused in the doorway, his eyes filling with tears as he took in the sight of his daughter as a bride. "You look just like your mother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She'd be so proud, Nora girl." Nora crossed the room to embrace him, careful not to crush the wildflower bouquet she carried. "I wish she could be here. She is in her way." Thomas patted her back gently. "She's in that blue of your eyes and in the way you love with your whole heart." He stepped back, offering his arm. "Now, let's not keep that fine man of yours waiting. He looked about ready to jump out of his skin when I saw him earlier." The town square had been transformed for the occasion, with benches arranged in neat rows and an arch of twisted iron, a joint creation of the bride and groom standing at the center. Nearly the entire town had turned out for the event, curiosity drawing even those who had been most critical of the match. As Nora and her father approached, the crowd rose to its feet. Nora kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, where Grant stood waiting beneath the arch, his face lighting up as he caught sight of her. He was handsome in a new suit, his green eyes bright with emotion, but it was the look of absolute certainty on his face that steadied Nora's steps. When they reached the arch, Thomas placed Nora's hand in Grant's with the formal dignity of a man honoring an ancient tradition. "Take care of each other," he said simply, then stepped aside. Reverend Matthews, who had initially been reluctant to perform the ceremony outside the church, but had eventually been won over by the couple's sincerity, smiled at them both. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed square. The ceremony itself was a blur of emotions for Nora. She heard the familiar words, felt the weight of Grant's hand in hers, but it was only when they came to the vows that the moment crystallized into perfect clarity. "I, Grant, take you, Nora, to be my lawfully wedded wife." Grant's voice was steady and strong, his eyes never leaving hers. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." As Nora repeated the same words, her voice clear despite the emotion tightening her throat, she felt as if everything in her life, every struggle, every tear, every moment of doubt had been leading her to this moment, this man, this promise. "The rings, please," Reverend Matthews prompted. Grant produced 2 bands of gleaming gold, each engraved with a simple pattern of intertwined vines. He slid one onto Nora's finger, the metal warm from being held in his palm. "With this ring, I thee wed," he said softly, the traditional words taking on new meaning in the depth of his gaze. Nora took the second ring and placed it on Grant's finger, marveling at how right it looked there. "With this ring, I thee wed," she echoed, her heart so full it felt as if it might overflow. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Matthews declared. With a smile that suggested he had come to appreciate the unique couple before him, he added, You may kiss your bride." Grant stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame Nora's face with infinite tenderness. "My wife," he whispered for her ears alone. Then he kissed her, a kiss that sealed their vows and promised a lifetime of love and understanding. The crowd erupted in cheers, led by Thomas Sullivan's enthusiastic whooping. As Nora and Grant turned to face their friends and neighbors, now officially husband and wife, Nora caught sight of Sally Jenkins beaming at them, and beside her, several other young women who had always stood a little too tall, spoken a little too loudly, or simply never quite fit the mold Hillsboro expected them to fill. In their faces, Nora saw something she recognized: hope, and the dawning realization that perhaps there was room in this world for women of all sizes and strengths to find love and happiness. The celebration that followed was unlike any Hillsboro had seen. Tables laden with food and drink filled the square, and a band played lively tunes that soon had people dancing despite the early hour. Nora and Grant moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes, their hands rarely leaving each other's, even Mrs. Wright seemed to have softened somewhat, approaching the couple with what appeared to be genuine if surprised goodwill. "It's an unusual match," she admitted, her eyes moving between them. "But seeing you together, well, perhaps unusual isn't always a bad thing," coming from Mrs. Wright. This was high praise indeed. Nora smiled warmly at the older woman. "Thank you, Mrs. Wright. That means a great deal." As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the square, Grant drew Nora aside into the shadow of the newly built schoolhouse. "Happy, Mrs. Lawson?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Nora admitted, resting her hands on his shoulders. "Though I'm still getting used to the name." "You could keep Sullivan professionally," Grant suggested. "Nora Sullivan, blacksmith, has a ring to it." The casual acceptance of her continuing to work after marriage was yet another reminder of how truly Grant understood her. "I've been thinking," she said slowly. "What if we combined our businesses? Lawson and Sullivan, master blacksmiths. We already work well together." Grant's face lit up with enthusiasm. "I think that's brilliant. We could expand, take on bigger projects than either of us could manage alone." "Exactly." Nora felt a surge of excitement at the possibilities ahead. "We could become known throughout the territory for quality craftsmanship. Maybe even teach apprentices someday. Including our own children, perhaps." Grant's voice was gentle, tentative, as if unsure how she would respond to the suggestion. Nora felt a flush of warmth at the thought. "I'd like that. A son or daughter with your eyes and my height, learning the trade from both of us." Grant smiled, pulling her closer. "A whole line of unusually tall Lawsons, making their mark on the world one hammer stroke at a time." The image made Nora laugh, a sound of pure joy that drew glances from nearby guests. "I love you, Grant Lawson," she said, looking down at the man who had changed her world with nothing more than his willingness to look up and see her clearly. "I love you for making me believe that being different isn't the same as being wrong." "I love you, Nora Lawson," Grant replied, his voice thick with emotion, "for being exactly who you are and for teaching me what true strength looks like." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Hillsboro, Nora and Grant rejoined their celebration, moving among friends and neighbors who had, over the course of their courtship, gradually come to see what they saw in each other not an odd mismatch, but a perfect fit. Later that night, as they walked together to their new home on the outskirts of town, Nora looked up at the vast canopy of stars overhead. For so long, she had felt constrained, limited by others' expectations and her own doubts. Now, standing beside the man who had chosen her precisely for who she was, She felt as boundless as the New Mexico sky, as strong and enduring as the mountains that framed their horizon. "What are you thinking?" Grant asked, following her gaze upward. Nora smiled, squeezing his hand. "I'm thinking that for the first time in my life, I don't wish I were any different than I am." Grant stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "You're perfect to me, Nora, just as you are. Too tall, too strong, not feminine enough by some people's standards. Those aren't flaws. They're what make you uniquely, wonderfully you." He reached up to touch her cheek gently. "And I'll spend the rest of my life reminding you of that if I need to." As they continued toward their home, built to fit them both perfectly, Nora felt a sense of completion, of coming full circle. The girl who had once hunched her shoulders and tried to make herself smaller had become a woman who stood tall and proud, with a man beside her who matched her stride for stride, heart for heart, strength for strength. In a world that had tried to tell her she was too much, Nora Sullivan Lawson had finally found where she belonged, not by changing herself to fit others' expectations, but by holding true to who she was until the right person looked up and saw her, truly saw her, and said the words she had waited a lifetime to hear. "You're perfect to me."